Bruh. 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 Bruh.
I sacrificed $20 and now I'm salty. Hey there hunters, and welcome back to my series of Let's Talk About games where I just try to, well, talk about other games that I'm playing that I'm not directly making content for. Today's topic is Salt and Sacrifice. Now a few months ago I'd made a video discussing how much I loved Salt and Sanctuary and had recently played through it again on PC with some mods. It's an amazing game and still one of my favorite Souls-likes. Seriously, play it if you haven't, it's a really good game. In that video I was also talking about how much I was excited for its sequel, Salt and Sacrifice, since it was just a few months away at the time. Unfortunately, Salt and Sacrifice is a pretty bad game. It's not even just a bad Souls game, it's just a bad game. So sadly, I am making this video to discuss all the things I did not like about Salt and Sacrifice, as I've now finished the game just under 20 hours and would like to sort of review it and just kind of talk about all the downsides it has. Let's start with a brief overview of the game. Not much has changed as far as the base formula goes. Salt and Sacrifice is still very much a 2D platformer, Souls-like RPG thing, and it still has the same bells and whistles as you might expect from this kind of genre of games. One of the big changes they made though was that instead of having the world be like one big open place, which did promote much more freedom and traversal and what areas and bosses you could encounter, instead Salt and Sacrifice has a sort of hub and world system like Demon Souls, where you do your leveling, crafting, and upgrading in town, then you go out of the gate and you go to the world and just do your fighting and such out there. So from the gate you just go from there to one of these 5 worlds and that's basically it. While there is nothing wrong with this kind of setup, there's more issues with the maps that I have, which is the first thing I wanted to get into. Exploring in Salt and Sacrifice is a chore. There's no shortcuts or additional waypoints inside of a map. There are obelisks which you can use to checkpoint and respawn at, but you cannot travel between them, and anytime you go back to town from them, you have to come back at the very beginning of the level. So the player has to decide if they want to take their souls and go back to level, or risk losing it by continuing on until you find your next checkpoint. Again, while this is not a terrible design on paper, and I'm going to be saying that a lot in this video, the convoluted layouts of these maps make it very annoying to try and backtrack. The levels of these maps make no sense. Like the very first level, Ashburn, has a city segment above the ground level and a castle on top of that, and you're constantly finding layers of above ground and underground and open space in between that just kind of make it incredibly difficult to discern where you actually are in the relation of the starting point, unless you have some sort of photographic memory. I didn't think the maps would make me so annoyed, but they really do. There's also a ton of cliffs and puzzles and platforming, which again, wouldn't be a problem, that's great, good stuff, but they're all incredibly tight windowed, and then that often you just fall to your death. As a common theme here, normally this wouldn't be a problem, but the issue is that enemies are constantly being respawned and placed at edges just to knock you off, and if you die, your corpse with all your souls drops where you actually died at, not right before. So if you fall off a cliff somewhere, well GG, your body's halfway across the map that you might not even be able to reach. I will discuss it later too, but enemies launch players extremely far, so falling to your death becomes commonplace. Next, let's talk about the player, stats, equipment, and all that sort of thing. So some interesting and questionable changes were made in Salt and Sacrifice. They removed parrying, yeah, no parry, in a Souls game, right? Weird. Instead, you just have block and perfect block. As you'd imagine, blocking eats stamina and HP depending on your block value of your weapon. So obviously perfect blocking sounds good, right? Well, yes and no. Sure, it's good if you time all your attacks well, but recovering from the block animation takes time too, so there's actually very little window to retaliate even if you do perfect block. And also monsters do chain attacks very often, so you would have to block, 2, 3, 4 attacks in a row. Also, failing to perfect block obviously leads to getting hit, or normal blocking, which is almost as bad. See, there's two things that happen when you block. Not only do you use the block animation, which does take time to recover from, it also allows enemies to prep their attack, and they will because enemies are relentless in this game, but also blocking eats stamina and HP. If you run out of stamina, you cannot regen stamina for a moment, which means you can't block or roll, and enemies are just free to combo wombo you. Blocking doesn't feel good to do at all, it's just awful. And maybe it's just me, or maybe it's because you also can't equip a shield unless your weapon comes with one. Yeah, that's another thing. Weapons are just all over the place. Rather than have a main hand and an offhand like you used to, you just have 2 weapon slots that you can swap between. So weapons like daggers or katanas or maces, 2-handed weapons, scythes, spears, all that stuff cannot have a shield equipped because they don't come with a shield. Only the Vanguard class and some other type of weapon actually gets the sword and board setup. So most weapons don't block well. You end up eating 60% of the damage and stamina on block. So rolling becomes the safest option, but rolling also eats a huge chunk of stamina, which just makes most of the fight slow and boring, as you only have time to roll, poke once, and then wait for regen and roll away, rinse and repeat. And my highest stat next to dexterity was willpower, which is stamina, so it definitely wasn't that. The weapons are kind of all over the place too. I don't understand what this game's going for. There's not a single katana, dagger, or bow with above C in dex scaling, but many of the 2-handers and like hammers and stuff have A and S scaling and strength. Damage is weird because every weapon has full or mixed elemental conversion, which doesn't seem to do anything since you can't apply ailments with regular attacks, so your fire or poison weapons don't actually cause status buildup. You're just checking against enemy defense stats, which of course you have almost no idea what it is. Did you know that the water mage has high darkness defense? Weird, right? No one knows that shit. Salt and Sacrifice did add weapon arts though, they're called runic arts in this, which admittedly is a really cool feature for the game, but it did come with drawbacks. Because runic arts use L2 and face buttons to use them, and I feel like that's why we lost parry. It was block and square before, but now it's block and square, triangle, circle to use a weapon art. Weapons can have up to 3 weapon arts, which is great, but these also required a special equipment unlock in your passive tree. So unless you dive into the magic section of this tree to unlock those, you can't even use them. So rip strength users. Magic also became gutted because of this. There aren't any spells anymore. Now all the staves have weapon arts, which are basically their spells. It's really watered down the whole magic system in a game that revolves around mages and hunting mages. So yeah. Outside of the weapons, the armor and trinkets were also pretty boring. Nothing did anything special outside of some numerical increases, like here's some life, or some more weight, or fire attacks deal more damage, stuff like that. I was never really excited to see any armors, rings, charms, or anything because it barely made any difference. I think the stamina ones were like the best. It was also impossible to get an armor set with appropriate defenses across the board, as they all pretty much focused in one elemental defense, and you're constantly fighting 2 or more enemy mages, taking fat amount of damage either way, plus constantly swapping out armor sets and upgrades and stuff is going to just take way too long and be too tedious to do. So I ended up just sticking to the very first armor set in the game, which was from the Fire Mage, because it also happened to be the only light armor set in the game with poise, and poise is incredibly important. See, poise isn't hyper armor in this like it is in Souls games. If you get hit and it breaks poise, you bounce, and enemies will juggle you if you bounce. So you do get bounced, and you do get juggled all the time. That's typically like 90% of my deaths is I get juggled. Even near endgame, I was sitting on like 30 plus poise with light armor, which seemed pretty good, but nah, pretty much everything breaks through it. And I'm sure blocking would help you not get bounced, but again, I have daggers and their block is bad, so there's not much of a reason for me to risk blocking at all, just rolling. So the last thing about the players I want to talk about is the skill tree. It looks similar to the original Salt and Sanctuary tree, and it is, but it's even more boring, which is surprising. See, the only thing in the tree is passive stats and equipment tier unlocks. At least in the original Salt and Sanctuary, it had like flask charges and some other weird stuff in there. However, you can spec out of all the stat nodes in between those, leaving like chunks in your tree, and it's weird. So you can effectively just run around and grab all the equipment unlocks, and then just unspec out of all the stat points. And I mean, the weapon unlocks add stats anyways, so I don't know, it seems kind of pointless to have, you know, individual stat points, right? This all felt incredibly weird and wrong. Like, I don't know if that's how it's supposed to work, but it looked kind of dumb. Oh, also I reminded myself, flash charges. Let's talk about consumables. See, in every single Souls-like game, including Salt and Sanctuary, you'd expect to recharge your flasks and stuff at your checkpoint, right? Well, yeah, that's kind of how it is here too, but none of it's free. You need to pick up berries for every charge of your flask, and it gets consumed every single time. So 1 berry is 1 sip. So there's a good chance you're actually going to run out of flash charges and have to just go and pick berries or farm money forever. Same goes for mana flasks, and even ammunition. Look, I know ammunition doesn't need to be infinite, but it's handled incredibly dumb here. Every ranged weapon has the ammunition item. It's the same item. All the crossbows, bows, throwing items, throwing daggers, whatever. All the same. Guns are gone, sad face. All the ammunition costs 1 ore to make, 1 shot. So every time you throw a dagger or shoot an arrow, that's 1 ore that you have to mine or buy later. I was constantly out of arrows and effectively couldn't play a range build. You're only allowed to keep like 16 arrows at the start, and then you can upgrade up to a bit more, and I think I had like 23 by the end of the game, but that's still not enough to get through, you know, like an actual like build going around with ranged weapons. And you can't just buy ammunition, you have to buy ore, which is expensive, and it's just, trust me, it's impossible. Basically, I was just always out of arrows, and effectively just couldn't play the range build I wanted to. Everything in the game just felt like it had to be tedious for the sake of being tedious. And I still finished it in 20 hours while grinding a lot, so it's not that big of a game. Okay, let me get on to another big topic, the bosses. I'll group mages and bosses here, but let me just briefly go over the normal bosses. See, every zone has like 2 or 3 actual bosses, and every single one of these bosses was a complete pushover. They all only had about 2 or 3 attacks, then they unlocked like 1 more move in their base combo at like half health, and then a second move in their combo at like 30% health. That is it. None of them had any personality, nothing interesting with the fights or the encounters at all. Just a few swings, maybe an AoE, and maybe a ranged attack. That was it, even up until the last boss. Beat him on the first try. All he did was a few different swings and attacks. Nothing special, very lackluster. In fact, I'm going to show the last boss fight here. It's nothing. Don't worry about spoilers, don't play this game. Anyway, on to the mages, which is another huge part of the game because the game is basically revolving around you as an inquisitor hunting mages. The maps are locked off and you have doors that you can only open if you've hunted X amount of named mages in the areas, which you obviously have to find around the maps. So the only way to progress is to hunt mages, and all the mages work exactly the same. It's a big guy that summons 1 of 3 different adds, as a melee weapon, and 3 different spells that fill the entire screen. They're all incredibly annoying to fight because of the juggling issues with, you know, poison stuff. If you get hit once, you're going to just get juggled constantly. They also teleport around the maps and you have to chase them constantly to get them into their actual boss zones where you can kill them, but they can warp to places you haven't even unlocked yet. So you can be chasing a mage around for 5 minutes, then it just goes out of reach and well, now you're boned. Their minions are also incredibly annoying, not just because they never stop spawning, but they can also attack as they're spawning, so you can just get grabbed by a beam of light or something because you just weren't sure of what it was going to be. Everything about the mages just feels bad, and I thought the game would pick up or get different later on, like in the second half of the game, but no. Pretty much the first 10 minutes of the game is the entire game loop, just, you know, for the next 20 hours. You fight the exact same mages throughout the game, but of course, you know, each new zone unlocks new mages that you can spawn. It's just annoying though, like you have to fight all these mages and then they're constantly on the map, so you can fight like 2 or 3 at the same area, just spawning together, AoEing the screens, and they're just warping all around. You just can't escape them, and they're spawning ads everywhere. It gets really annoying. The entire game is focused around hunting these mages too, and I just didn't want to do it. It just felt terrible. So ultimately, nothing in Salt and Sacrifice was satisfying. It was just always annoying or always tedious. And I'm okay with things being hard or grindy, but the payouts better be good. And this game just doesn't do that. There was never a time where I felt super hyped that I killed a boss, or was excited to try new gear or find new equipment or even try new builds. Souls-like games need those rewards for the players to justify the difficulty and the frustration, and for the most part they do. Salt and Sacrifice does not though, and I'm sorry because I was really excited to play this game and I loved Salt and Sanctuary, and I still do. I plan to replay it again in the future, but this game, Salt and Sacrifice, is just a bad game. It's not even just a bad Souls game. I just regret my time playing it wholeheartedly. It was not enjoyable, it did not feel rewarding, and I was just frustrated about every little thing the more I played. I'm sorry. Thank you all for watching though, and good luck out there, hunters.